Hi, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com. Today we're going to make an apple custard tart, and this is what it looks like. There's 3 components to this tart. On the bottom we have a sweet pastry crust, which has this kind of crisp, almost cookie-like taste and texture. And then we're going to fill the tart with lots of slices of apples and a creamy, smooth custard. And as you can see, after it's baked, what I like to do is brown the tips of the apples. I think it makes it look really pretty. So we're going to start with our sweet pastry crust. I'm actually going to make it in my food processor. You could do this by hand, or you could even use an electric mixer. The first thing you will need is 1 3/4 cups, which is 225 grams of all-purpose flour, plain flour. Put that in there, along with just 1/4 teaspoon, 1 gram. I'm using a fine kosher salt. You could just use a table salt. And then I'm also adding 7 tablespoons, which is 100 grams of room temperature butter. I'm using unsalted. If you wanted to use salted, you could. Just leave out the salt I just put in there. And I did cut it into just cubes like this, just so it mixes faster. So now what I'm going to do is just process this until we have coarse crumbs. It's all mixed together and it's starting to come together. Whoops, this way. Doesn't take very long. I'm just going to move this out of the way. So really what we're doing is just moistening all the flour with the butter. As you see, that was easy. So if you wanted to use just by hand, you can just mix it with your fingers, work the butter into the flour, or you can just use your, if you have a stand mixer with the paddle attachment, same thing. So now what I'm going to do is add 1/4 cup, which is 50 grams of granulated white sugar, sweeten that up. That's what gives it more like that cookie-like taste. And I'm just going to mix that in, like so. And then our last thing is I have 1 large egg, have it at room temperature. A large egg out of the shell is about 50 grams. I'm going to add 1 tablespoon just of water and just beat this up. I'm using a wire whisk. You could just use a fork. Just kind of break it up a little. Okay, and I need my spatula. Just add that right in there. And then we're just going to process it till it's, you know, all the dry ingredients are moistened and it starts to come together. Okay, pretty easy. So, let me get all that out of the way, because now we are going to roll it out right away. I mean, if you don't have to, if your pastry was really soft, or you kind of go, I don't feel like doing that right now, you could just wrap it up and put it into the refrigerator, you know, for a day or 2 even. Now, I'm not going to use all of this pastry, so what we need is about a 9-inch tart pan. You want 2 pieces like this, 9 inches, 23 centimeters. And what I like to do, just in case you want to remove the bottom plate, like some people when the tart's done, they don't want to serve it on the bottom plate. So what I like to do is just very lightly, I'm just using a little butter. You could just spray it or oil it. that bottom plate, and that'll help it release. Because sometimes I've forgotten to do that, and then it sticks a little. And I don't like that, so let's put that back in there. So now, like I said, I'm not using all this pastry. You want about 3/4 of it. If you have a scale, you will need about 300 grams. Now, so you will have a little left over. Don't throw it out. What you could do is, I mean, there's lots of different things. You could make about 3-inch tarts at 7.5 centimeters, and you could bake them off like we're going to do this crust. Bake them off blind, and then you could fill them with like a lemon curd or pastry cream and fruit. Or you could make like, you know, if you go to the our YouTube channel, joybaking.com, or our website, I have like jam tarts. You could make that with this, the leftover, so don't throw it out. Or little, you know, you can make little, I also have mince tarts. It's around Christmas you're making this. Okay, so you can see it's a really nice soft dough. So like I said, 300 grams. All right. Let's put that right in there for now. So now we are going to roll out. So you'll need a rolling pin, whatever type you like, and we need to flour our surface. Whenever you're rolling out dough, keep moving it around. Because if you just put it down and roll it out and don't lift it up, it'll stick to your counter. So always roll, lift it up, turn it. Okay, and a little flour on top. And we'll start rolling. So what I do is I use my base as a guide of how big. You want it a few inches past the size of this, so, you know, 5 centimeters past. So that's the best way I use. Because, you know, if you were maybe using a little larger or a little smaller tart pan than I have here, I mean, you could use like an 8-inch or even a 10, which is 20 centimeters or 25 centimeters. For those using metric. See, so I'm just moving it around. That way, I find I can get it in a better round shape, because sometimes I end up with a not quite round. And then, you know, you can stop. If it's getting out of that round shape, just, you know, stop and fix it up. Okay, so I've rolled it out. You know, make sure it's the same thickness. And the way I do that is just run my hand over it. You can kind of tell if there's places that are a little thicker, just, you know, roll that out. Especially, you know, typically in the center, it's thicker. So now, I learned this trick. Actually, I learned it from the Great British Baking Show, if you ever watched that. Mary Berry showed this. I think it's a fantastic trick. Take your plate, because this pastry tends to be, if you roll it around your rolling pin and try to put it in the pan, it tends to tear and crack, and it drives me nuts. So what she did is she takes your thing and you just, now make sure, what I'm going to do is just make sure it's loosened up, and then just take your, and slip it under like this. And try to get it into the center of your pastry. I can feel it. Is that not cool? And then all I have to do is take my, and just take the ends, forgot to do that, and just kind of go like this. Lift it up and put it in. Like that. I think it's so cool. And then you just, and if it does crack a little on the sides, big deal, you can just fix it. I think it's just brilliant. You can pick up tips, baking tips all over. And then just kind of press down a little to make sure it's into your tart pan really well. If it tears, you know, just put it back together. You'll never know. I mean, even if you want to do it the other way and roll it around a rolling pin, it cracks. Doesn't matter. You can just, with this pastry, it's very forgiving. So once you've kind of, take your finger and just kind of make sure it's in the corners all the way around. Because we're going to actually bake this off just as it is, so we don't want it shrinking. And one way to prevent that is not to overhandle it, but also to make sure it's in the corners. And then just kind of take it over the sides, like so. And then you could take your rolling pin and roll it to get rid of the, or you could just, even with your, sometimes I just do it with my palm of my hand, and take off any excess. Again, you can fuss, make sure it's nice. And then just take a fork, and then we're just going to lightly prick the bottoms. That'll help prevent it from puffing up as we bake it off. So now what I'm going to do is put this into the refrigerator to chill for, you know, about 15 minutes. If you want to leave it longer, of course you can do that. I'm going to leave it in there about 15 minutes while I preheat my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 180 degrees Celsius. And when we come back, we will bake it off. So now we have preheated our oven. Our pastry has chilled. Now we are ready to bake it off. So what you want to do is have I like to have a larger baking sheet. It's easier to move than a tart pan in and out of the oven. And then we're going to fill our chilled pastry shell with some, well, I'm going to use just beans, some dried beans. You can actually buy pie weights, but I never have. So I just use beans. You could use rice as well. And you also want to first put down some parchment paper. So what I like to do, because sometimes when you put your parchment paper in your shell, it can kind of stick to the pastry. We don't want that. So I'm just going to lightly spray it with one of those non-stick sprays. You could oil it or even butter it. I just want a very light coating. So a little trick I learned after, you know, a few times of the paper sticking. So then what we're going to do is I'll just put, and don't forget, if you forgot before, don't forget to prick the bottom of your pastry, because we don't want it. We want to prevent it from puffing up or shrinking. So that's why we chill it. So now just fit it in there. Now, if you're using beans like I am, you cannot use these to eat. Once you open and use it for this, then what I do is after I'll let them cool down, and then I put them in a container, and the next time I want to do this, I use them again. But unfortunately, you can't eat them. So just, you want to put in enough beans, pie weights, or rice just to weigh that down. Make sure it's all the way around, like so. I don't think I need quite. Okay, that looks good. So now, we want to bake this off just until it's starting to turn like a light golden, just tinged. So what I do, and you know, everybody's oven is a little different. I'm going to bake it. You want to bake it first about 20 minutes. I'm going to say around 20. You know, you can check it around 18 minutes or so, and then just kind of peek and make sure your pastry is dry. And then take out your paper, just lift out the paper and the beans, and put it back in the oven for about 5 minutes or so until you will start to see a little tinge of brown. So 20 minutes initially, take out the beans and paper, and then another about 5. So our pastry crust is done. So just put your pan on a wire rack so you can see it's dry. It's just starting to get tinged with brown around the outside. So now what we're going to do is let this cool down to room temperature, and then when we come back, I will show you how to seal the pastry. So now our tart shell has cooled down. It's just a touch warm. So what we're going to do is seal it with some apricot preserves. Now we do that so that, one, it does add a little bit of flavor, but mainly what we're doing is sealing the crust so that when we put in that custard, it doesn't seep into the crust and make it kind of soft, because we want to keep it nice and crisp. So some people just beat an egg white and then brush it, use that. But I like to use the apricot preserves, because it does add a nice flavor. So what you will need is 1/4 cup, or that's 80 grams of apricot preserves. Now you want to heat them up till almost to boiling. I just did it in the microwave, but you could just do it on the stove in a small saucepan. And then what we want to do, I just put it into a strainer, because you know apricot preserves have some lumps of fruit. We want to get that out. We want a nice smooth glaze. And we're also going to use the apricot preserves to brush the top of our tart once it's baked. Again, for it adds a little bit of flavor, but two, it'll prevent the apples from drying out. So I'm going to use it twice here. That looks good, most of it. And then it's a little thick. So what I'm going to do is thin it out. Now, you could thin it out with just 1/2 tablespoon just of water. But if you want, you could add a little alcohol. If you had some apple brandy, that would be perfect. I don't have that in the house, so I'm using 1/2 tablespoon of Grand Marnier. You could use some rum. Or, like I said, just water. It's fine. And then you just got a pastry brush. Oh, I can smell that Grand Marnier. And we're just a thin coating. And even do the sides. And then what we're going to do is you want to let your glaze completely dry. Now, this type of tart is a little labor intensive. As you can see, this took a little bit. So what I typically do is I divide the making of this tart up into 2 days. The first day I do right to this point, and then I let the apricot preserves that dry, and then I cover my tart shell, and I usually put it in the fridge, or you could have it at room temperature if your kitchen's not too hot. And then tomorrow we'll come back and then we'll finish off the tart. That way it's not, because it is quite a bit of work. So if you divide it up between 2 days, a lot better. So that's what we're going to do. And next up, we will make our custard. So now for our custard, you will need a medium-sized bowl. And in there, I'm going to put 1/3 cup, 65 grams of granulated white sugar. And then I'm going to use a bit of a thickener, so 2 tablespoons, 20 grams. I'm using all-purpose flour, plain flour. If you wanted to, you could use cornstarch instead of the flour. I've tried it both ways, both the same. And then I'm just adding just a pinch of salt. And whisk that together. To that, I'm going to add 2 large eggs. 2 large eggs out of the shell is 100 grams. Have your eggs at room temperature. And I'm just going to whisk that in. I mean, if you wanted to use a hand mixer for this, you could do that, but it's not very hard. If you don't have a wire whisk, you can just use a fork. Okay, so now, in a small saucepan, I'm going to put 3/4 cup, which is 180 milliliters, 180 grams. I'm using half and half cream. You could also use like a light cream. And while I'm doing it on the stove, you could do it in the microwave. I'm going to put this just on medium-high heat. Watch it carefully. You'll see the bubbles around the outside. You want to get it because as soon as after it bubbles around the outside, it'll start to foam up. So don't let it overflow. So watch it carefully. Starting to get bubbles around the outside. A little more. Oh, just as soon as it starts to foam up, grab it. So now, we're putting a hot liquid into eggs. So what you want to do is whisk the whole time and just add a little. It's called tempering it so that they'll both be at the same temperature. And once you do that, then just keep whisking, whisking. And we'll add all of our cream. And that is, well, we just have the flavoring to add. That's our custard, pretty easy. So what I'm going to add is a half a teaspoon, 2 grams of pure vanilla extract. You could add a little bit of apple brandy if you had some, or again, Grand Marnier would be also very nice, but we'll just use vanilla. So that's our custard. I'm just going to put that aside to cool down a little. I'm going to clean up and we'll come back, do our apples, assemble our tart, and bake it off. So for our apples, you will need about a pound of apples, 450 grams. But actually, I like to have more than that because you never know when you peel your apples whether there'll be any bruising or anything like that. So I would say you're probably going to need about 3 to 4 apples. So I would even have 5 just to make, because you don't want to run out. So peel, core, and then slice them pretty thin. I just, somewhere between, 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch, like so. You can see that? That's about what you want. So now we have our, remember we pre-baked our sweet pastry crust. We covered it with the apricot glaze. That's nice and dry. Like I said, I actually did, this is the second day. I did chill this overnight and then bring it back up to room temperature before you fill it, or it'll take longer to bake. So when I put my apples, I mean, you could just kind of throw them all in there, but we'll get fancy today. So what I like to do is first, just takes one, I kind of have a border. After much fussing with this is kind of how I find it works best for me if I want to do the concentric circles. And I'll have to cut a little piece. So you put that like so. That looks good. And then what we're going to do is just overlap our apple slices. So just keep overlapping, moving around. I go in one direction. Find that the easiest. And it doesn't have to be perfect. This is, you're not, it's not a bakery tart. So don't worry if it doesn't, all the slices aren't perfect. Because once we put that custard in and bake it off, you're really not going to notice. Okay, so I fussed a little, got the outside, pretty good. I'm okay with that. So now we need to do the inside. But first, I didn't tell you what kind of apples you should use. So any firm textured apple that will keep it shaped, when it's baked. You don't want it turning all mushy. If you want to, I tend to use a sweet tart type of apple like Honey Crisp, Gala, Brayburn. You can use thin John of Gold. If you want to use Granny Smith, you could use that as well. But keep in mind, that's a little more tart tasting. I've used them all. I like them all. You could actually use a couple different types. You use a Granny Smith with like a gala. So now what we're going to do is fill the center. I'm going to use some of my, again, you might, for this, you might have to do a little cutting if they don't fit. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to fit. This is why, you know, you might want to have a few extra apples just in case. So that looks good to me. I'm going to leave it at that. So now we are going to cook this again at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 180 degrees Celsius. So, you know, have your oven preheated. And now we're just going to pour in the custard. Again, put your tart pan on a baking sheet. Makes it much easier to get it into the oven. And now I'm just going to pour our custard. Hopefully we can use it all. You know, you want to fill it, but leave a little space at the top. I mean, you don't want it overflowing. I think we'll be okay. That's about right. So this is a 9-inch, 23-centimeter tart. I used the whole thing. If you wanted a little bit of cinnamon flavor, you could sprinkle with a little cinnamon sugar over the top, but I'm just going to leave it like that. So now, baking. Somewhere, I'm going to say 30 to 40 minutes. I'm giving you a little range because, you know, everyone's oven is a little different, as I always say. So really, essentially what because the tart shell is baked off, what we're doing is baking the custard until set. So if you kind of take the pan, it'll know it won't jiggle anymore. And if you took a really sharp knife at the end tip and put it into the apples, it'll be nice. The apples will be nice and tender. So I'm going to say 30 to 40 minutes. Carefully into the oven. You don't want to spill your custard. So our apple custard tart is ready. So put your pan on a wire rack. Doesn't that look gorgeous? Our custard is set. You kind of just shake the pan. Shouldn't wobble at all. And our apples are nice and tender. So I'm just going to let this cool for a few minutes, and then when we come back, we're going to brown the top of our tart. So now we're going to brown the top of our tart. You don't actually have to do that. You can just serve it like this, but it looks kind of more professional if we brown the top. If you have a handheld butane torch, you could use that for this job. I don't have one. So I'm going to use the oven. So you want to use the broiler, which is the top element in your oven. Turn that on high. Now, people ask, the only time you use, or almost the only time you use, the top element in your oven is for broiling. When you're baking a cake, do not have it on. Just have the bottom element, or when cakes, cookies, all that. But for broiling, browning the top, it's ideal. So what I like to do is first sift a little bit of confectioner sugar, powdered sugar, over the top. And then I'm going to put this, use this. If you have parchment paper, if you did have parchment paper on your baking sheet, get rid of it, because I have done that and it can brown. And I'm going to be moving the pan around to get an even brown, or as even as I can, so do not walk away. So I have my rack a little distance so I can put my sheet. So I'm going to let it sit for a bit, and then I'm going to turn it. Okay. Turn that off. So if you saw, I kept turning. It takes a while to start, and then once it goes, you have to keep turning it. I like mine, you may say that's too dark for me. I like mine not burnt, but I like it quite dark. If you don't, you know, you can take it out at any point that you want, but that's kind of how I like it. So now, what I like to do, remember those apricot preserves that we didn't use all of? So what we're going to do now, you probably, if you had them sitting out on the counter, which I did, you might have to just heat it up either in your microwave or just on the stove just to get it fluid again. And then with our pastry brush, I'm going to brush it gives it a nice shine. The apple's a nice shine. Plus, like I said, it prevents them from drying out and it adds more flavor. Now, I just don't do the apple slices. I actually do the whole tart because I like the look of it. Plus, it keeps the custard from drying out. Okay, that looks good. I even did the crust here. Give it a little shine. Okay. And one final thing. It's optional, but I have some pearl sugar here. Another thing sometimes I like to use is sliced or shaved almonds. And what I do is put it around the outside. It kind of, it makes the whole thing kind of pop. It's these little touches, you know, if you go into a fancy bakery, you notice the finishing is what takes it from like, you know, a home-baked good to the professional. So we can borrow some of those things at home, especially on special occasions when you want to have something special. So there we have it. I just love it. A work of art. So now what I'm going to do is let this cool down, and then we'll take off the sides and we will try a piece. So I let the apple custard tart cool down to room temperature. Now we'll remove the sides. The pan, I just take a cup there, turned upside down. Put that on there, slides away. Now, I typically, if I'm at home, I just leave that bottom plate on there. That way I can pick it up and move it around. If you wanted to remove it, then just take your spatula and then you can see you can just run underneath. And then actually if you have one of these, a real big one, just put it under there and move it to your serving plate. But like I said, I'm going to leave it there because it's kind of good to cut. So then we'll take our knife. You know, it's so pretty, I hate to cut into it, but I will. Sharp knife. And there we go. Like I said, we finished it off really fancy. You don't have to do that, but I actually recommend it because I think it's worth, you know, browning the apple slices under the broiler and then putting a little apricot glaze. I mean, it just makes it all pop. So you can just serve it plain. That's usually what I do. Although, I'm not against a little scoop of vanilla ice cream, a little dollop of whipped cream, creme fraiche, whatever you like. You know, I know it's a little bit of work to make this tart, but it's worth it. It's so good. You have that, the sweet pastry crust is crisp and cookie-like, a little bit of sweetness to it. You have the apples, they're so flavorful. And then that custard is just wonderful. And I really like that addition of the apricot glaze. You know, it's on the base of our tart, it's on the top, and it really adds, you know, a nice flavor to our tart. So it's really good the day it's made. I do, because it's a custard, I do recommend, if you want to store it, you cover it and store it in the refrigerator. I think it's best because of that custard for, you know, 3 or 4 days, and then I eat it cold. Or you could just, you know, pop it in the microwave and just reheat it or bring it to room temperature. So, really, for those special occasions, or say on a weekend you want a special project, make this. And until next time, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com.